Well, I hope you all enjoyed the British Grand Prix. What a spectacular race and event it was, wasn't it? If you were there, I hope you loved it in the sunshine. It's not all the time that we get a British Grand Prix bathed in glorious sunshine. So, massive respect if you made the journey up, and I hope you enjoyed the weekend. If you were a Lewis Hamilton fan, I imagine you spent much of the race angry and frustrated at that first lap incident with Kimi Raikkonen. If you were a fan of Sebastian Vettel or Ferrari, you'll have been happy, of course, because the cards all fell in their favour. If you're a fan of motorsport, well, you were just served up an absolute treat. And that's what I take from yesterday. I took that it was a great race. It was a great race weekend. It had a bit of everything. It had the drama, the controversy, and controversy makes for good motorsport, makes for a good talking point. It had safety cars, of course, which closes up the field, as we know. It had overtaking. It had pretty much everything we needed, all the ingredients you need in the pot to make a spectacular Formula One race. So, from that perspective, what a wonderful weekend. As ever, though, it's raised a number of questions, and thank you again to everybody who has put hashtag Ask Elvis on their questions. It makes them so much easier for me to find. I've got loads. It's Q&A Monday. Let's start smashing through them. Right, lots of people questioning the severity of that penalty handed out to Kimi Raikkonen after the first lap incident with Lewis Hamilton. I know that it heavily compromised Lewis's race. So many people asking this, I can't really pick one, but the general gist, I will go with this one here from Martin Strumpfer, who says, do you think Kimi got 10 seconds for hitting Hamilton because of the outrage of the 5 seconds that Vettel got in France? Steward's inconsistency? Question mark. Okay, well, I think you can't help but have some influence by what has gone before, and I know that we need consistency. I talked about this in a video just a week or so ago, and I think you need consistency, whatever the situation is, whatever the decisions might be, whether we think 5 seconds, whether we think 10 seconds, whether we think stop-go penalties, being black flagged, whatever you think is the right decision, or whatever the stewards think is the right decision for an incident, then I think it just needs to be consistent at race to race throughout the season. Now, a few people asked, is this the stewards taking into consideration the championship, the fact that Kimi affected one of the main championship contenders races in Lewis Hamilton and spun him out, knocked him to the back? They're not supposed to take that into consideration. And look, I can see it from both sides. No one's going to be happy with whatever the punishment might be for these things. Personally, I kind of think it was about right. And I actually disagree, and I've mentioned this before, I disagree with people who say you've got to take into consideration the consequences of the accident. Yes, to some extent, but the fact that Lewis Hamilton ended up spinning and ended up being last at the end of lap one is almost just a factor of luck or bad luck on his part. It's not actually as a direct result of the severity of the mistake that Kimi made, because that mistake that Kimi made was probably less severe, I guess, than the one that Sebastian Vettel made back in France, where he damaged Valtteri Bottas's car and it affected him for the whole race. Lewis, yes, he had a spin and he ended up at the back, but he also ended up with an undamaged car, the fastest car pretty much on the entire track at that point, and was able to make his way right through the field and get right back towards the front again. So, look, what happens after the incident in terms of consequences, in terms of where a driver ends up, what damage may occur at that moment, or whether it occurs later in the race in terms of a puncture or floor damage like we saw with Bottas's car. Personally, for me, you need to remove all of that. You need to look at the incident, the contact, i.e. Kimi made a little mistake, he locked up, he ran into Lewis, it was lap one, it was turn 3, in the middle of that melee, that was it. It was a mistake, small mistake. Yes, the consequences were severe, but I don't think you can punish that mistake more so than you would punish a mistake that ended up, similar mistake if it was Kimi, that ended up spinning Lewis out and his race being over. If he'd crashed out, hit a barrier at that point, it's still the same mistake that Kimi made. The consequences for me need to be removed from when we're dishing out penalties. But that's just my opinion. I know lots of people have different ones because I've seen lots of comments from you all. Let me know. Let me know if you agree, disagree, whether you think the penalty was harsh enough, whether you think there should be a wider range of penalties or just more consistency across the board, let me know. Robert Tinsey says, I find it curious that a safety car was called for a spin that was way off track with no debris to clean. I thought this was why virtual safety cars were invented. Ericsson crashed 80 plus metres from the track, yet a safety car was called. Did his crash sensor trigger a red light to the FIA? No, I don't believe that was the reason that a safety car was called. I think the fact that we had to have marshals and safety vehicles on the track removing that car from the barriers, it needed some considerable rebuilding, the tyre barrier wall, and we needed to get that car off the track with a construction vehicle. I think the FIA take those incidents very seriously when you've got to have personnel on the track in that sense. I know it was a long way off, and I think they deliberated for some time before making the call of a safety car. I don't think you can really argue with those type of situations. When there's safety of marshals involved, if the FIA and the race director, Charlie Whiting, deem it necessary to throw a safety car, then that's what has to be done. And I think we all need to respect that decision, because their safety has to be paramount. In the end, it actually really helped spice up the race. So from a neutral's point of view, I suppose most people were probably happy with it. Andy3E says, hi Mark, do you think we've reached the pinnacle of pit stops? I can't envision anything sub 2 seconds, and I can't see the guys at work. It leads to mistakes and unsafe releases. Do you think the show would improve with fewer people for pit stops? Well, I've spoken about this before, and actually I disagree with you, Andy, I'm afraid. I do understand your perspective. I understand your point of view. We have seen sub 2 second pit stops. It's definitely possible. We've seen teams do it. For me, those incredibly mind-blowing pit stops improve the show. For me, it's a wow moment. And if you switch on Formula One as a new fan and you see a modern Formula One pit stop, for me, you can't help but be wowed by that and think, that's unbelievable. That's the kind of thing that, normal human beings just could not do. And for me, that's what Formula One should be about. Jason J says, hi Mark, could you please explain in the next video how can a floor upgrade make Ferrari gain 2 to 3 tenths in Silverstone? What could they have done to make the floor gain so much? Well, first of all, I don't think it's just about the floor. Every big Formula One team is constantly bringing gains and upgrades in terms of performance of their car. Ferrari have redeveloped their floor. They've clearly done a good job, and it can be simple things. There's a number of areas that a floor affects on a car. Obviously, you're talking about absolute downforce. The underfloor performance brings downforce through the diffuser, particularly. So there could have been efficiencies brought to the profile of some of the vanes underneath the car, for example. And I'm completely guessing because I don't know what they've done. I haven't looked at it in detail yet. It could be something around protecting the rear tyres or the diffuser channel by tyre squirt slots, for example. Having a more efficient or more powerful tyre squirt slots just ahead of the rear tyres, which protect the diffuser flow from the turbulent wake of the rear tyres. It could be that. Again, I don't know, but there are so many areas around a floor that have such a big impact on a Formula One car's performance that you can either find a big gain in one of those areas or lots of little gains in lots of small areas around that flow, around that component. But the bigger thing here is that it's not just about the floor. They won't have just upgraded the floor. They will be bringing upgrades in lots of different areas, and it's about the package that you put together for that particular event. It might not be an upgrade. It might be how you set the car up for that particular circuit. It might be the wing configuration that you've put on your car for that particular weekend, combined with the tyres you're using, combined with the tyre pressures and the camber angles and the toe angles and all of the different constantly variable parts of a Formula One car add or detract from performance. And if you get them all right on one particular day, you can actually make a significant gain to the overall performance of your car. So it might not just be about the fact they brought a new floor. Right, really nice comment from Andrew Ryder. It's not really a question, but I just wanted to flag it because I think it's really nice that you've mentioned it, Andrew, and I think actually it should be something that is highlighted a bit more. Andrew Ryder says, we F1 fans owe a great deal to the F1 crews, which I'm sure bore the brunt of the efforts to bring about the triple header that we've just come through. Thank you. I'm sure F1 Elvis could tell us all about their work. Well, look, Andrew, you're absolutely right. And this, we talk about unsung heroes in F1, the mechanics, the engineers, the staff of a Formula One team, particularly those that are travelling, those that are on the road, really do suffer through this triple header. It's never been done before. This is a long, tough season anyway in Formula One terms, but to have 3 races back to back on the bounce does put a huge amount of pressure on the boys and girls in those garages and in those teams. And yes, they end up working, long, late nights, not just because Formula One now has a curfew on Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights within the Formula One pit lane. So you've got to be out by a certain time each night. That was a regulation brought in to try and prevent teams working all night long. But on Wednesday, on Tuesday, on Monday nights, on Sunday nights after a Grand Prix, there's no curfew. And when you've got back-to-back races coming thick and fast like that, those are the nights that you end up sometimes working well into the early hours of the morning just to make sure that when you get into the curfew days of Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you don't end up coming close and having to push and break the rules with those curfews. So it doesn't get highlighted very often, but these back-to-back races put so much pressure on all of those people. Not only are they working long hours and late nights and early mornings, but they're working under intense pressure. If you've had a bad weekend, there's no time to be dwelling on it and worrying about it. You've got to be rebuilding your car. If you had a crash, you've got to be rebuilding everything, stripping everything down, repairing things and getting it all back together. The motorhomes have got to be disassembled, travelling from one venue to the next and then reassembled in record time. The factories as well, of course, are having to deal with turnaround of parts and sub-assemblies. So everybody within a Formula One team is under pressure during these moments of a triple header like this. And by the time they got to yesterday, Sunday evening after the British Grand Prix, although we've only now got 2 weeks until the next race, which for an F1 team, they don't have anywhere near 2 weeks. They've got essentially a week before they're back at the racetrack, starting to prepare for the next race. So, this is a slight break that they've had, a slight moment to breathe, but it's nothing more than that. And that will have come as a big relief come Sunday night for those boys. So well done, Andrew. Thank you for flagging it. Massive respect for everybody in the Formula One pit lane. They have done a wonderful job, and he's absolutely right. They have kept the show on the road for all of us watching from home. Tony Leach says, I would like to know what the small holes across a tyre surface are. Have seen it in many F1 tyres and I've just seen it on an F2 tyre as well. Is it just for probes or does it have a deeper meaning? Well, actually, what we're talking about here is those tiny little holes that are put into the mould. So when the tyre goes into the mould, there is a little extrusion. So when the rubber is poured in, it leaves that little hole in the surface of the tyre. The reason it's actually there in the first place is to just give you a visual indication of how much rubber is left on the tread of that tyre. So once you've got the tyre in from a run and you've scraped away all the pickup, all the marbles and all the surface debris on the surface of tyre, which they do, they use a hot scraper to scrape that debris away so you get down to the actual surface of the actual tyre. Then you can see very quickly how much of that hole or that indentation is left, and therefore a very quick visual representation of just how much you've worn through the surface layer of that tyre. That's the reason. Right, final couple of questions. Tony KHZ says, if this year's car, and he's talking about the McLaren here, has less downforce than last year's, could they use last year's chassis, if the regulations allowed, of course? If it's too big of a change, could they introduce a completely new concept of car this year, presumably they have the money, that is more designed for next year's season, keeping within regulations? Well, Tony, first of all, particularly this year, they definitely can't use last year's car because, of course, this year we've introduced the halo. And that's not a case of just bolting the halo on top of an existing chassis. The chassis has to be designed in quite a large way around the integration of a halo. So there's no way you could just go back to last year's chassis. In terms of designing a new chassis now that's ready for next season, most teams wouldn't do that because you need all the development time that you can get to leave next year's car up to almost the last moment that you can, so you allow yourself all the testing and development time that you can back in the factory ahead of next year's season. So if they brought a car out now, the learning and the understanding would have moved on so much by the time we get to the beginning of next season that actually they'd probably be some way behind the rest of the field who've been constantly developing in the wind tunnels and in CFD in their factory. So it wouldn't really make too much sense. Unfortunately for McLaren, who don't have a good car this year, they are kind of stuck with it. But don't forget, next year we've got a big aerodynamic change. We've got completely different wings. We've got completely different wings, front and rear, brake ducts, barge balls. Lots of things are changing for next year. So there's very little that we can apply to this year's car that will be a direct transition over into the 2019 car. Okay, finally, Maxim Kiva says, when F1 cars crash, do they have specific equipment to check for damages, or do they just check visible damages only? So if a car crashes, is it just about the mechanics having a good look over it with their eyes, or do they use specific equipment to see if there is any damage? Yes, they use both methods. So of course, you have a good visual look around the car, and lots of people do that. They are experts in their field. They are trained to see when something is out of the ordinary, but they also use a number of different means to test various components. Metal components can be crack checked using ultraviolet lights and ultraviolet dye, sort of penetrant dyes that will get in and show any cracks, even hairline cracks under a UV light. Very, very effective, very simple. For carbon fibre components, they have methods of what they call proof testing, where they're able to sort of twist and bend and put loads onto the components, and whilst they do that, they can measure the amount of flex, they can listen for things creaking and cracking, and they have a number of different... It all comes under the banner of what they call non-destructive testing, or NDT, which they can do both at the factory and on the road at the racetrack each evening at the end of a session, particularly after a shunt or a trip through the gravel, something like that. So they will use all of those things, but of course, more often than not, and perhaps the biggest indication when you've got damage on a race car, is that the mechanics will be looking over this thing with a fine-tooth comb, looking for any abnormalities, anything that's out of the ordinary that might show some sort of damage. And if there's any doubt, even the tiniest bit of doubt, the component will come off and they'll get a new one on. It doesn't mean that component goes in the bin, but it will go back to the factory for perhaps even more in-depth testing. If it's proved to be okay, it will go back into the pool of spares. If not, it's on the scrap heap or being repaired. Right, that has got to be it for today. Thank you so much again for all the questions. I'm always blown away by how much passion there is with you guys and how much you're willing to take the time to write in and send me these questions. I really appreciate it. I couldn't do these videos obviously without you doing that, so thank you. Keep them coming, because I will try and answer them in the comments section of this video, or on Twitter or Instagram, or wherever you send them to me. Use hashtag AskElvis, as I said, it makes it much easier. But thank you very much. I really hope you enjoyed the British Grand Prix weekend. It was a stonker. We're in for a fantastic Formula One season this year. I am loving every moment of it. I think we've had the odd dull race, if you want to call it dull race, but the majority of this season has been spectacular and full of drama, excitement, controversy, everything that we want from an F1 season. And at the top, it's close. I'll see you tomorrow.